My name is Hassan Malik, and for most of my life, I believed I had clarity. As a Muslim cleric who immigrated from Jordan to the United States in my early 50s, I found purpose, stability, and a calling that felt like divine placement. My days revolved around prayer, community guidance, and preserving the tradition passed down to me from generations of faithful men, my father, my grandfather, and those before them. In our modest community mosque just outside Cleveland, Ohio, I became a spiritual anchor to many. Faith was my language. Certainty was my shelter. I was 68 when everything changed. It began with fatigue, nothing unusual for someone my age, I thought. But then came the weight loss, the persistent nausea, and a pain deep in my stomach that refused to be ignored. After weeks of postponing it, my wife, Layla, finally forced me to see a doctor. The diagnosis was swift and brutal: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. My physician, a gentle woman named Dr. Patel, spoke with that rehearsed compassion I imagine she gave many patients. "We can begin treatment immediately, Hassan, but the prognosis is difficult. We may be talking months rather than years." I nodded, not out of courage but numbness. I had always preached that suffering was a test, a sacred measure of one's devotion to Allah. With hardship comes ease, I had told countless believers from the minbar. And now, I clung to those same words like a drowning man to driftwood. My days were consumed by chemotherapy and silent supplications. At night, Layla would hold my hand and recite verses from the Quran, her voice quivering but unwavering. I prayed with desperate hope, not for healing but for peace. "If this is my end, Ya Allah, let it be honorable. Let me meet you in peace." But my prayers were answered in a way I never expected. It happened on a Wednesday. I had just returned home after an especially exhausting chemo session. My body felt like a battlefield, burnt out and brittle. Layla helped me into bed, kissed my forehead, and whispered something about heating soup. As I lay there, a sudden tightness gripped my chest. At first, I thought it was just muscle cramping, but then my breath caught. A sharp pain radiated down my left arm. Panic surged through me. "Layla," I managed to croak. That's the last word I remember saying. Darkness collapsed in around me, but I was still aware. I was floating. Not metaphorically. My body, at least what I thought was my body, hovered above the hospital bed. I could see nurses flooding the room, their voices urgent, their movements frantic. Layla stood in a corner, crying, her hands trembling as she recited Ayat al-Kursi over and over. My physical form was pale, still, and unresponsive. Yet I felt calm. More than calm, I felt freed. The pain had vanished. My thoughts were sharper than ever. Is this death? I wondered. No fear gripped me, just a curious sense of detachment. Time lost meaning. Space felt infinite. I drifted upward, slowly, like mist rising toward the morning light. Then I saw it, a light in the distance. Not harsh or blinding, warm, radiant, and indescribably peaceful. It didn't call to me, but I was drawn to it, like gravity pulling at the soul. As I moved toward it, I began to hear familiar sounds: my mother's lullabies, the echo of my father's evening prayers, the soft rustling of olive trees in my childhood courtyard back in Amman. It was like reliving every beautiful moment of my life at once. This must be paradise, I thought. I wept not from fear, but from a joy so intense it became overwhelming. But that feeling didn't last. As I neared the light, it flickered. Then, suddenly, everything shifted. The once vibrant surroundings withered. Trees that moments ago shimmered with life now blackened and crumbled. The warm air grew cold. A stench filled my senses, a pungent, acrid smell of decay. I began to hear cries: men, women, and children sobbing, wailing, begging. One voice cut through them all. My mother's. "Have mercy," she screamed, again and again, as if in torment. Her pain wrapped itself around me like a chain. Darkness swallowed the space. The light was gone. I couldn't tell up from down, left from right. Panic surged in my chest. I was suffocating, not physically, but spiritually, as if every certainty I had ever carried was being stripped from me. Then, through the blackness, a throne appeared. Massive, imposing. It hovered in the distance, shrouded in mist and authority. Seated upon it was a figure I recognized instantly. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But he was bound in chains. His hands and feet shackled. His face heavy with sorrow. Tears streamed from his eyes. He looked at me not in judgment, but in grief. My knees buckled beneath me. I tried to speak, to cry out, to question what I was seeing, but no sound came. The Prophet, our beloved messenger, the one I had spent my life studying, quoting, defending, was shackled. The very image shattered something inside me. This couldn't be. This was not what I had been taught. Why is he bound? I tried to scream. He looked at me, sorrow in his eyes, and in that moment, I felt the weight of 1,000 unanswered questions pressing on my soul. Then, from the darkness surrounding the throne, a voice emerged. It was like nothing I had ever heard. Not loud, but unignorable. Not angry, but terrifying in its clarity. Hassan, it is time to know the truth. Before I could respond, a great book fell from the sky, slamming into the ground before the throne with a thunderous crash that sent tremors through the void. I recognized it immediately. The Quran. Its pages flipped by themselves, fluttering like wings caught in a violent wind. Then the voice spoke again. Who is Allah, Hassan? Have you ever truly asked yourself? The question hit me like a lightning bolt. 1,000 memories flashed in an instant, reciting verses as a child, offering sermons with confidence, counseling others with the strength of tradition. Never once had I questioned the foundation. Never once had I asked. Allah is the Creator, I answered silently. The most merciful, the all-knowing. How do you know? The voice asked again. A chill crept through me. I began to see images rise from the pages, visions from history unfolding in vivid clarity. I saw the Kaaba, not as I had seen it in my pilgrimage, but encircled by idols. Worshippers bowed, chanted names I recognized from pre-Islamic mythology, Allat, Al-Uzza, and others. The voice whispered, before Islam, Allah was known, but not alone. I saw more visions of ancient lands, people offering sacrifices to a towering idol. Etched into the stone was a name I recognized, Baal. And beneath it, written in characters hauntingly similar to Arabic, was another name, El. Then I heard it again, Ba. Have you ever thought about their connection? The implications made my mind reel. These were things I had never allowed myself to consider. The faith I had built my life around, the certainty I had offered others, was it founded on truths I had never truly examined? I fell to my knees in the vision, clutching my head, the weight of it too great to bear. Have I been deceived? I whispered to the darkness. I awoke gasping for breath. Bright fluorescent lights blinded me. Nurses shouted in relief. Layla was crying beside me, whispering prayers. A defibrillator beeped somewhere behind me. I had returned. But something was broken. No, not broken, changed. I lay in that hospital bed for days, too weak to walk, too shaken to speak. The vision, the voice, the question, who is Allah, haunted me relentlessly. I tried to pray, but the words felt foreign. I tried to lead myself back to familiar belief, but every verse I recited brought more doubt than comfort. My faith, once so unshakable, now felt like a fragile house of glass. Layla sensed it. She sat beside me every night, holding my hand, her silent presence a comfort even though I could not speak of what I had seen. I didn't know how. How could I tell the woman who had followed me into a foreign land, raised children in my faith, sacrificed for our community, that I no longer knew if what I believed was true? After I returned home, I barely left the study. My books, once solely Islamic texts, were joined by others. Books on ancient Semitic religion, historical studies of the Near East, academic writings on the development of monotheism. I read like a man possessed. I learned that the Arabs before Islam believed in Allah as a high god among many part of a broader pantheon. That the name Allah was used in pagan rituals long before the Quran. That the Kaaba, the holiest site in Islam, was once filled with hundreds of idols. I didn't know what I believed anymore, but I knew I could never go back to blind certainty. At night, I would wander into the backyard, where Layla had cultivated a small garden, roses, mint, basil, and a jasmine bush that always reminded me of my mother. I stood beneath the stars, looked up at the vastness of the night sky, and whispered, "Creator, if you are there, show me." For the first time in my life, I was praying without a name. It was a strange sort of irony how the man once revered as a guide, a voice of certainty, now stood lost in his own garden, whispering into the night, unsure if anyone was listening. I stopped going to the mosque. At first, I blamed the chemo, then the weakness. But the truth sat heavy on my chest like an invisible burden. I could no longer preach what I wasn't sure I believed. Word spread quickly in our close-knit community. Whispers started. The Imam is sick. The Imam is tired. Then more pointed murmurs, has he lost his way? They didn't know the half of it. Layla, ever my shelter, didn't pry. But her eyes, those deep wells of quiet strength, searched mine each night. She saw the distance. She felt the storm. And still, she brought me tea, adjusted my blanket, and never said what we both knew: I was unraveling. One night, as I sat by the garden window, our youngest daughter, Miriam, crept in. She had always been a thoughtful child, more observer than talker. She sat beside me and looked out at the stars. After a long silence, she asked softly, "Baba, is it okay to change what you believe if you learn something new?" Her question stunned me. I couldn't answer. My throat tightened. This young girl, barely a teenager, had named the exact weight pressing on my chest. Was it okay? Could a man spend his whole life in one truth and then, in the space of a moment or a vision, find himself pulled toward another? "I don't know, Habibti," I whispered, "but I think the truth can survive our questions." I began spending time in the hospital chapel. Not to pray, at least not in the way I used to. I didn't kneel. I didn't recite. I simply sat. The chapel was quiet, filled with sunlight during the day and flickering candlelight at night. People of every faith came and went, some whispering rosaries, others meditating silently, a few just crying. No one asked questions. No one judged. It became the only place I could breathe. I noticed things I never had before. A Buddhist patient who could barely walk would sit cross-legged in the corner every evening, his face serene despite his pain. Christian nurses treated me with kindness so gentle it felt sacred. A Jewish doctor, whom I knew from my treatments, worked tirelessly through her Sabbath to care for patients in critical care. She once told me she believed healing others was its own form of worship. They didn't preach. They didn't try to convert. They just lived their faith, and something about it stirred me. There was a humility in their devotion that felt different than anything I'd known, a kind of freedom. Then one afternoon, as I sat in the back row of the chapel, a young man approached. He wore scrubs. A resident, maybe. His beard was trimmed, and he had the look of someone who still bore the weight of youthful idealism. "Assalamu alaikum, Imam Hassan," he said. The title stung. I offered a weak smile. "Wa alaikum salam." He sat beside me, unsure of how to begin. "I used to come to your mosque," he said finally, "back when I was a student. I always admired your sermons." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. After a pause, he continued, "I'm struggling. With medicine. With faith. With all of it. It's hard reconciling science with what we were taught." His honesty was like a balm. Here was someone else walking the same tightrope between what we were handed and what we discovered. "I know what you mean," I said. "Sometimes the questions outgrow the answers." He looked at me, surprised. Maybe he expected a defense of dogma. Instead, we sat together, two Muslim men, one once a leader, the other still trying to find his footing, united by uncertainty. When he left, I realized I didn't feel ashamed. I felt understood. That evening, I stood in the garden again. The sky was a blanket of stars. A breeze rustled through the jasmine. I closed my eyes and prayed not the way I used to. No memorized verses. No precise posture. Just this. God, whoever you are, show me who you are. I'm listening now. The next morning, I returned to the chapel before dawn. The hall was empty, bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. I sat in the last pew, my hands resting on my knees. I wasn't sure why I was there. Maybe it was habit. Maybe it was hope. All I knew was that something was pulling me back. A moment later, I heard the soft sound of footsteps behind me. "Mind if I sit?" a voice asked. I turned. A man in a simple white clerical robe stood there, holding a Bible in one hand. His eyes were kind, weathered in the way only those who've walked through fire can be. "Of course," I said. He sat beside me in silence. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence was companionable, like old friends sharing a memory. Finally, he turned to me and said, "You've seen something, haven't you?" I froze. He didn't ask it with suspicion, not like an interrogation. He asked it with recognition. I nodded, and before I knew it, the words came spilling out. I told him everything: the vision, the prophet in chains, the ancient voice, the questions that tore through my beliefs like a storm through dry grass. I didn't even know why I was telling him. But the tears came as I spoke, and I didn't try to stop them. When I finished, the man placed the Bible on the pew beside us and said quietly, "What about Jesus?" The name felt like thunder in the stillness. Jesus? I had seen no vision of him. He hadn't appeared in the darkness. But why then was his name echoing in my thoughts? Why did it feel like his presence had been behind everything, even in absence? I didn't see him, I replied, my voice shaking. The man nodded gently, like he'd heard that before. He opened his Bible to a passage and read slowly, his voice steady and filled with weight. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." John 14 verse 6. The words pierced through me like light through stained glass. They were not forceful, not arrogant. They were a declaration of identity, not of domination. And something in me broke. Not out of fear, not out of submission, out of recognition. It was as if something that had been buried deep inside my soul began to stir, something that had been waiting for years. Not a rejection of everything I had known, but a fulfillment of it. Could it be? Could Jesus be what I had been searching for all along? Not a contradiction of truth, but the completion of it? Over the next few weeks, I met often with the chaplain, Father John. He told me his name was. We didn't debate theology. We didn't argue doctrine. We talked like two pilgrims walking different paths, both seeking the same sunrise. I read the Gospels in a quiet corner of the hospital library. I found myself drawn to the words of Jesus, not just what he said, but how he said it. There was authority, but there was also deep compassion, forgiveness, honesty. The parables struck me like poems written for my soul. The Sermon on the Mount brought me to tears. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." It was as though Jesus wasn't just speaking to the crowd on the hillside, but to me, across centuries, across faiths, across pain. I wrestled with it. I argued with it. But I couldn't walk away from it. And one morning, as the sun rose over the city skyline, I returned to Father John's church and stood in the aisle. "I want to know the truth," I said. He smiled, not in triumph, but in welcome. "Jesus has been waiting for you, Hassan," he said softly. That day I was baptized. As the water poured over me, I wept not from shame or guilt, but from a freedom I had never known. The chains I had carried for years, chains of fear, of duty, of performance, fell away. I wish I could say everything became easier after that. It didn't. When word spread that I had left Islam, the fallout came swiftly and without mercy. Friends from the mosque stopped returning calls. Some crossed the street to avoid me. A few even sent angry messages, condemning me as a traitor, an apostate, a disgrace. One former student I had mentored for years told me I had been seduced by the West and that I was no longer welcome among the faithful. I had expected resistance, but not the silence from people I had once called family. The hardest part, though, was watching Layla's eyes fill with confusion and quiet pain. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. That wasn't her way. But the hurt was there in her body language, in the way she lingered in the hallway instead of sitting beside me in the study, in the way her hands trembled slightly when she served dinner. "How could you?" she asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. I had no perfect answer. "I didn't go looking for this," I said gently. "It came to me. I resisted it. I tried to forget it. But the more I ran, the more I realized. I wasn't running from something false, I was running from someone true." Her eyes welled with tears. She looked away. "Everything we've built, the life we made." "I know," I said. "I know. And I'm not asking you to follow me. I'm just asking you not to hate me for finding something I didn't expect." She didn't speak, but she didn't leave, and that somehow was enough for now. The days following my baptism were filled with strange contrasts. On the one hand, I was spiritually reborn. The scriptures were no longer texts to study but food for my soul. I devoured the Gospels with a hunger I hadn't felt since I was a child reading the Quran in my grandfather's study. On the other hand, my body was failing, or so I thought. I had missed 2 chemotherapy sessions since the hospital incident. By the time I returned for a follow-up, I expected bad news. Dr. Patel greeted me with the same calm professionalism, but this time, her eyes betrayed something else: confusion. "We ran your labs twice," she said slowly. "The markers are gone." I blinked. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean, the cancer is not just shrinking, it's not there." I stared at her, waiting for the correction. She tapped the monitor again. "Hassan, I don't have a medical explanation. I've seen tumors reduce after intense chemo, but never like this. And you've skipped treatments. It's impossible." But I knew. Even before she finished the sentence, I knew. I had been healed. Not because I had earned it. Not because I had recited the right prayers or performed the right rituals. I had simply surrendered. And in that surrender, grace found me. I stood in the garden that night again. The same one where I had once whispered desperate questions into the wind. Now I whispered thanks. The jasmine was in full bloom. The stars shone like sentinels of peace. And for the first time in decades, I felt whole. Not because I had the answers to every theological question, but because I had met the one who was the answer. Today, I no longer wear a turban. I no longer lead prayer in a mosque, or teach the hadith to a circle of students. I am no longer called Imam Hassan. And truthfully, I don't miss the title. I am simply Hassan Malik, a man who once thought he had found all the answers, only to discover the truth was so much bigger and far more beautiful than he ever imagined. I spend my days quietly now. Layla still prays 5 times a day on her rug in the corner of our bedroom. She has not converted, and I don't push her. What we share now is something deeper than doctrine, a shared reverence for mystery, for love, for the one who made us. There is peace between us, even if her journey remains different from mine. Some nights, she watches me reading the Bible and asks me to read aloud. Sometimes she listens without speaking. Sometimes she cries. Sometimes we sit in silence, her with her Quran, me with my New Testament. And somehow that shared quiet feels more sacred than 100 sermons. I still walk through the neighborhoods near our old mosque, and I still see the faces of those I once taught. Most avoid me. A few nod politely. Some look away, unable or unwilling to face what I've become. But now and then, one of them approaches. Like the young nurse who stopped me outside the clinic and said, "I heard what happened. I'm struggling too." Or the Uber driver from Pakistan who recognized my face and whispered, "I've had questions since I was 15, but I've never told anyone." Or the father whose son left Islam and who now wonders quietly if love is more important than control. They don't come looking for answers. Just someone who understands the pain of asking. I offer them no sermons, no debates, just this. Ask. Keep asking. The truth does not fear your questions. I tell them about the Jesus I met not in a vision of glory, not descending from clouds, but in the quiet places. In the hospital chapel, in a stranger's listening ear, in the sacred echo of a child's honest question. And I tell them that he met me in my worst moment not to condemn me, but to carry me, not to shame me, but to free me. I do not claim to have found a new religion. I do not ask anyone to abandon their culture or heritage. What I found was not a system, but a person, Jesus. The one who looked at a dying cleric from Cleveland with more mercy than I thought I deserved. The one who answered a broken man's whispered prayer. If you are real, show me. He did. And now, every breath I take is a gift I never expected to have. Not because I was worthy, not because I figured it all out, but because he came looking for me when I didn't even know I was lost. If you are reading this and your soul is tired, if your questions have made you feel like a traitor, if you are clinging to faith out of fear instead of love, then hear me. There is more. There is freedom. There is grace. There is truth. There is Jesus. And he's not afraid of your doubts. He's waiting in the quiet. Just ask.